Well, hello there, and welcome to Strong, Courageous Men. I am your host, Caleb Effinger, and I have the joy of interviewing wise, godly men on a variety of topics. These conversations are intended to encourage us to be strong, courageous men, humbly living for the glory of Christ as we run this race toward heaven. Well, welcome to the show. Brian, this is a fun one to our audience. I get to interview one of our pastors here at GIBC, Brian Arnold. Brian, welcome so much to the show.
Oh, it's a privilege to be here. Thanks for having me, Caleb.
Of course. Brian, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, I'm a pastor here at GIBC, obviously, Grace Emmanuel in Jupiter, Florida. Privileged to be on this staff. It's actually the staff that trained me how to do ministry in the first place. I came to Expositor Seminary here. Man, it's been 15 years ago now that I came to the church here. I came with my wife and a few kids. At that time, we had 3 daughters. And then over the course of seminary and early ministry life, had 3 more sons. So, we're basically the Brady Bunch, 3 girls at the top, 3 boys at the bottom. I've been married to my wife for 23 years. So undeserved privilege there. She's godly, faithful wife and helper to me and mother to our children. So thankful for that. And my role here at the church, I lead Grace Life. It's a fellowship group here at the ministry. I served for 9 years before that in the youth ministry as the youth pastor here. And then about 3 years ago now, they transitioned me into an adult ministries, which we don't make hard distinctions as to age and stage, but mostly made up of young marrieds ministry here. So privileged to shepherd that group.
Yeah. And you know what, Brian, fun fact, I visited GIBC back in 2018. And the Sunday I was here for a couple of days. I was here for a Sunday. Guess who was preaching that Sunday?
And you came back.
Oh man, no! It's my wife and I are always super encouraged by your preaching and teaching. So we definitely appreciate you all.
Well, it's been a blessing to have you and your family here, brother.
Thank you. Okay, so today's topic is anger, and we will post links to Brian's sermons on these. I think you have a few sermons, or at least I know one, and so we'll post those online. But we wanted to get with you and kind of flesh this out, just one-on-one with you, because anger can sometimes be sneaky, and sometimes it's not sneaky. But to my shame, I didn't think I was an angry person until I had kids. Not that they're like, we love our girls, they're not horrible, but there's these moments when flashes of anger come out. And Brian, we're talking about just stupid little things, destroying a paper that I was writing. Like, who cares? Like, not a big deal. So anyway, so I'm excited to get your wisdom on this issue. So that being said, what are some root causes of anger?
Well, I mean, to begin, you're putting your finger on some of the issue with anger, and even the way you introduce that question. It really is a sneaky area of our life that, I mean, if we're honest, part of the problem is we oftentimes call it something other than what it is. We don't think of ourselves as angry people, even though we've got anger coming out all over the place. I remember early on, my wife and I were identifying some of the very same things you're talking about. We were realizing, man, we had some problems with anger, and we were in a season where we were finally, trying to not justify it and not excuse it. And we were seeing our young children were, what the Lord was using to bring that to the surface in that season. And so we spent the better part of probably 6 or 8 months, I would guess, walking through the scriptures together, just in our personal time. And, of course, when the kids are little, obviously in married life, you have all kinds of different seasons of how you and your wife will be able to try to get time together. in that season, it's nice because the kids have an early bedtime, so you can put them down, and we would have at least a few times a week where we would sit down and we just start opening up the scriptures. And one of the things we did, I remember in that study that was just so fruitful for us, is we just walked all the way through the Proverbs. We just read the Proverbs together, and we just started writing down every passage that has anything to do with anger. And so, by the time we were done with that, it took a number of months, but by the time we were done with that, we had our own little concordance there that we had built ourselves on the topic of anger. And then we started going through and we started saying, okay, of these passages, which of these texts best describe what we struggle with as we've seen it, in our own home? And so then we had kind of a subset list, I would say, of the anger passages biblically, and particularly in that portion of the study in the Proverbs, that best address the issues we were seeing in our home. And then we started from there saying, okay, so now what do these passages actually say about anger itself? What do we have to start to believe about anger? Because there were ways we were justifying it and ways we were excusing it, the sneaky ways that we call it something else. And so, over the course of that study, it was pretty shocking, what we revealed. I remember both of us sitting back and having conversations like, we can't seriously hate our kids, can we? And yet that's what the scriptures are describing as driving anger. We can't truly be bitter towards the circumstances that the Lord's bringing into our life. And yet that's what the scriptures were revealing. Then you get into, even, texts like what Christ would say in Matthew chapter 5 when he equates it to murder. And you recognize, wow, this is the same heart that drives some of the what we would describe as the worst sins, Right. And those are meant to shock us awake, to recognize what it is that's there in our heart. And I think that's really where you have to begin with any study of anger. You have to recognize that anger is not something outside of me. It's something that begins within me, begins in my heart. I know we're tempted to view anger as being something that's driven by circumstances. Well, my kids did this, my wife did that, the person driving the car in front of me did this, and some of the most ridiculous expressions of anger. But we look at it as something that's outside of us. It's external to us. Sometimes we can even excuse it as being something that, is just genetic. Well, I'm a type A personality. I've got Italian blood running through my veins, whatever you might describe that. That's right. I learned it from my dad. My dad was angry. And so that's just kind of the way I respond to life. It's something that becomes outside of us. And therefore, we don't have to own the responsibility of it. Well, the scriptures don't give us that option. Mark 7 makes it very clear that everything that's evil that comes out of us originates from within us, from the heart. And Christ gives a list there of some of the types of sins that come out of our heart. And it's interesting. One of them that he describes there is murder, which of course would be going right back to where he defines anger in Matthew 5 as murderous thoughts in the heart, or at least the same thing that drives murderous thoughts. So one of them he describes as murder, which is motivated by anger. And another one he describes there is malice, which would be a form of anger. And so we can't deny the fact that all of this comes out of our heart, right? Anger is resident within us, not outside of us. And then secondly, I would say if we recognize that anger is something that's within us and not outside of us, then we have to recognize that we have to own the responsibility of it. And that's oftentimes where we go wrong. We may even view it as something that's sinful. We may even view it as, it wasn't best. I didn't respond quite in the way that I should have. But the reality of it, when push comes to shove, we blame it on something outside of us. James 1 makes it clear that lust originates from within us, and lust is just any desire that you would have for anything that's opposed to the will of God in that context. And when lust is conceived, it gives birth to sin. It's not God tempting us. It's not our circumstances tempting us. James 1 would make all that clear. It starts within us. So we have to own the responsibility of it, and we have to recognize that this is a sin that's my problem. It's my issue to deal with. It's a hard issue that I have to wrestle to the ground. And so with that groundwork laid, I think the second thing that we probably need to make sure that we have is a right definition of what anger is. Anger is almost always, in fact, I would say always, this is what I would give as essentially a definition of anger. It's seeking justice in the face of a perceived injustice, whatever it may be. So it's seeking justice in the face of a perceived injustice. Now, I believe that's wide enough to include even some of the things that we might get to later, assuming we have time, but even things like righteous indignation, even the anger that's not sinful.
Yep.
But certainly the majority of our anger is going to be sinful anger. And so what does that represent? Well, there's some injustice that I perceive as being done against me personally. Right? So there's a personal offense. It's personal injustice. Someone, whether it's the guy cutting me off in traffic in front of me, or whether it's my child being an inconvenience in my life, or whether it's, something as major as a massive betrayal, by a friend or ministry partner or whoever it may be. I perceive an injustice against me. Then in anger, and when it's sinful anger, I then move to correct that injustice against me. And there are all kinds of ways in which I can choose to try to correct that injustice, right? I can go on the offensive. I can go on the attack. And so I start to retaliate, in some proactive way. I start to tear them down with, words that will be an attack against them in order to right the wrong, to settle the score, whatever it may be, to protect, what I'm concerned about and fearful of. And so I go on the offensive. Or there can be the more passive side of anger, which the Bible would define as things like bitterness. And that would be where it's anger that simmers under the surface. It's not really dealt with in the heart. I'm not really defining anger as what the Bible defines it as, but I'm also not, acting on it outwardly, at least not in a aggressive way. There's more of a passive approach to it. And the reason for that can be all kinds of reasons. It can be fear of man. It can be fear of consequences. It can be just an aversion personality-wise to tension and conflict, and you don't like those things. It can be self-righteousness. I'm not one who responds that way. They may get angry like that, but I don't get angry in response. And yet there's all this self-righteousness and bitterness in the heart that's building within us. And then oftentimes what that'll manifest itself as externally, at least in the moment, is some kind of passive aggressive tendencies. We withdraw, we give them the cold shoulder. Maybe we make some underhanded comments, but things that aren't, a proactive attack. Maybe we go to someone else to complain and gossip or slander about them. And there are all kinds of ways from there, but then that bitterness grows. It's not being dealt with biblically. And so where that inevitably is going to lead is more bitterness and more anger. That's why oftentimes someone in that passive aggressive camp, it'll lead to an eventual explosion, or everyone around them will be utterly confused. And oftentimes, including them, will be utterly confused. Where did all this come from? Because they don't feel that's not me. It's not the way I respond. So it originates in the heart. It's seeking justice for what we would see as personal injustices. And when I think about what it is in the heart that's driving it, to really get with that groundwork laid, I guess, to really get to the central question you're asking, what is it that drives anger? Well, I think that there's no better place to go than James chapter 4, which describes this. What is the source of quarrels and conflicts among you? So again, we think about quarrels and conflicts. Obviously, the only way we have quarrels and conflicts is when there's expressions of anger happening, there's tension in a relationship, there's personal offense that's taken place, and people are responding to those personal offenses in attack mode, right? Quarrels and conflicts. What's the source of these? So James is getting right at the heart of your question. What is it that drives these in our heart? And oftentimes, in James, he gives what seems like a very simplistic answer, but it's really a pretty complex one, or a pretty rich one in regards to the fullness of it. He says, "Is not the source your pleasures that wage war in your members?" So your pleasures. Of course, that would describe the whatever it is that you want. Pleasure is something you desire in the moment. So I'm desiring something that's not being fulfilled. Now that leads into a whole bunch of answers to your question that even come before that. So what do I have in life that leads to these pleasures and desires that get to such a degree to where I'm willing to quarrel and conflict in order to gain them, to express anger in order to gain them? Well, I must have expectations. I have expectations about how my life is going to go. Yeah. Expectations aren't necessarily sinful. They're not necessarily here nor there. You can have expectations. In fact, it's impossible to live life without expectations, but those expectations can very subtly and easily become entitlements. I feel entitled to gaining those things. I feel as if I'm owed something in life. And then those entitlements, or once something's an entitlement and it becomes shaky as to whether I'm actually going to receive that entitlement or not, well, now if I believe I deserve it, suddenly there's an injustice, at least in my mind. Yeah. And that's why the definition of recognizing even that injustice is a perceived injustice. Because oftentimes it's not actually an injustice against me, but I'm perceiving some wrong.
Yeah. Right? But Brian, I'm the most important person. Why shouldn't everyone respect me? Why shouldn't everyone, bow down to me, right?
Sure.
Man, this is good stuff.
Well, and you're hitting right on the key to it, because there's a selfishness. There's clearly an earthly minded selfishness that's James is promoting here, or describing as being what's in our heart. These pleasures that they're tied to earthly minded things. And you can see that. He says, you're envious and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. Right? He down below, he says, you adulteresses, do you not know that friendship with the world is hostility toward God? There's an earthly mindedness in our anger. I'm about what I can gain here and what I think will make me happy here in my desires. And intrinsic within that, so, selfish desires, earthly mindedness. We already mentioned it. Envy, being envious or covetous, we could call it, right? Which is described even in the Decalogue as being one of the primary first expressions of what God would describe as his law against sin. And then he ties it together. You do not have, so you commit murder. Well, I don't think that the churches to which James was talking about here had a murder problem in their midst, right? I don't think that they were going around, murdering one another. I think the urgency that this would probably find itself in chapter 1, if that were the case, right? And these were people. No, what's he talking about? He's tying it back to Matthew 5, to what Christ would say. It's the same driver in the heart. It's anger, same thing that drives murder. So you're envious. So in your heart, you murder each other. You fight and quarrel, right? That's what he's describing. And then the other thing we have to recognize, to answer your question as to what motivates it, is this whole idea in James 3. He says, you do not have because you do not ask. And I think really, if you were to get down to the root core level that I would say drives the rest of it, what is it that drives anger? It is unbelief at the very core level. Why do I not have? Because I don't ask. Or when I ask, as he says next, I ask with wrong motives. It's an earthly minded idolatry for the things that I want in this life that are not fueled by faith in what God gives as being best and good and right. So what do I start to do? I perceive, and this is really where it has to go in our heart, what God has given as being an injustice against me. God has not given me what I deserve or what I'm entitled to or what I have a right to. And if we believe that God's sovereign, we ultimately have to go there. We don't like to go there. And oftentimes we don't go there in our proactive ways that we shepherd our hearts, but that's what has to be going on in our hearts. Do we believe God is sovereign or do we not? Is the circumstance he's given to me today with my kids who are, being an inconvenience, or this guy in traffic who's cutting me off, or this massive, area of a boss who's being unreasonable and over the long haul in some very difficult ways, or even in our culture today, right? Where we have a country that's, turning headlong towards folly and persecution and all that will destroy our way of life that we may like and appreciate and want to keep. Is God sovereign over that? Do I have a right to be angry over these things?
Yeah.
Well, in the end, we don't have because we don't ask, or we ask with wrong motives. There's a faith problem at the core of it that I think drives the rest of it. So,
yeah, that's really good. A couple things as you were talking there. So I'm a simple mind, so I need simple word pictures and stuff. So we really get caught up in earthly things, opposed to keeping our minds on heaven, which is where our minds should be. And then, secondly, it's all this really is against God.
That's right.
This anger, you're quarreling. Sure, it might be with people, but ultimately, like you were saying, you're saying, you're like Adam. God, this is the woman that you gave me.
That's right.
It's your problem, God.
Right.
And so, wow, this is really helpful, Brian.
Well, and in that, Caleb, even what you're identifying there is really perceptive, because there is also a pride that's in the middle of that. And James even mentions that. Why does he go at the end of the section here to say, humble yourself in the presence of the Lord? God's opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble, he says. So what's he recognizing? These fights, these quarrels, this tension, this anger that's coursing through your veins in the times when it rises up. You have to recognize that you're not trusting God with what he's given, and you're elevating your perspective above his. So there's a pride, an earthly minded pride. Right?
Yeah. That's sobering and pride crushing as you say it out loud. And that's what we do.
Yep.
We shake our fist at God.
That's right.
So
yep.
Oh man. So okay. So what is the fruit of always being given to anger? So the person who has a pattern of being angry.
Well, there's lots of fruits that you won't want in your life.
Right.
I mean, Galatians chapter 6, verse 7, let's just identify it broad picture wise. God is not mocked. That scripture says God is not mocked. Whatever a man reaps, this he will also. Whatever a man sows, this he will also reap. So we have to recognize from the very beginning the principle in the scriptures, it's everywhere in the scriptures, of sowing and reaping. And so the question we always have to ask ourselves, and I know this is a podcast specifically for men, so as we think about it as men, the question we have to ask ourselves is, what am I sowing into my family and into my leadership and into my work and into my church life and into all these areas that God entrusts to my care? What am I sowing into that area in this arena of anger? Am I sowing things that the scriptures would describe as being honoring and things that will ultimately reap a good harvest in those areas? Or am I sowing seeds of sin that are going to reap what sin always reaps, which is wreckage and destruction in a host of ways? And one passage that I think really describes that well is Proverbs chapter 14. And notice what it says here. He who is slow to anger has great understanding. Which, by the way, in the Hebrew, this is that terminology like slow to. The idea of anger is often given in like the visual effect of nostrils being flared. So it even gives like this visual effect of somebody getting viscerally angry in a way that the nostrils start to flare and the face crunches up and whatever it might be. That's what's being described here. He who's slow to anger has great understanding. Right? There's wisdom, great wisdom in that. But he who is quick-tempered, so the exact opposite of that, he who's quick-tempered exalts folly. I often thought about this. You know what it does? It's like you are planting a flagpole in the ground, right? You are planting it in the ground and you are raising up this flag for everybody to see that just advertises the fact that I'm a fool. And that's not only in the way that others will view you, which does have a great impact upon our life. I mean, particularly when you're in a position of spiritual influence, right?
Right.
What example am I setting? Does my testimony have credibility? Am I viewed as a hypocrite? Well, will my faith be one that will be compelling to those around me? Well, you're exalting folly, right? But the other part of that is you recognize if you're exalting folly, that's also because you're acting foolishly. And, blows are for the back of a fool, the Proverbs would say. So we recognize there's going to be consequences. There's going to be ramifications on the wide scale here. You exalt folly. But then notice what it says next. A tranquil heart is life to the body in verse 30 of Proverbs 14. Tranquil heart is life to the body. So he's describing the same thing. Slow to anger, great understanding, right? That person who's slow to anger, who has a tranquil heart, man, it's life to the body. And I think of this in regards to your physical body, but I think it's even a broader illustration, but certainly physical health. I mean, any medical doctor will tell you that. What does a medical doctor say when you go in and, you're having some health effects? Oftentimes they'll say, I think you need to reduce stress in your life, right? Well, oftentimes what we recognize, what they're putting their finger on, even though they would have no idea, assuming they're not a believer, they would have no idea about the spiritual issues driving that of anger and lack of faith and trust in the Lord and anxiety and worry and everything that plays into this stress, right? But they're recognizing that there's a physical effect of these things. Even the medical community can document that. Blood pressure goes up, heart problems persist, anxiety can and anger over time can produce, problems in your digestive system and all kinds of. So it's life to the body, right?
Yeah.
But again, broader principle, but passion, he says. So the opposite of that, this is that, quick-tempered nature is rottenness to the bones. It rots it out from the inside. And not only, again, physical life, yes, but I think even bigger, I think about that from the standpoint of a man, right? In a position of spiritual leadership. I think about that as a man who's over the leadership of my own family. And I think, all right, I'm going to reap what I sow. So if I sow anger, then I'm going to reap the exaltation of folly and the consequences of folly. And a part of that is going to be, I'm going to rot out my family from the inside. And every area where I have spiritual influence. The more that anger is dominating my life in these areas, the more the influence of that rottenness is going to happen. It's going to erode away the relationships in my life. It's going to erode away my credibility and my testimony. It's going to erode away my spiritual influence in life. It's rottenness to the bones. And so, when you think about what the consequences and effects and ramifications of anger will be, it's like, this is heavy stuff. And you couple that with all kinds of, texts about, in Ephesians chapter 6, it talks about being wary of exasperating your children and those under your spiritual leadership. Well, in the parallel text in Colossians chapter 3, it talks about not being embittered against your wife, right? And it uses terminology in there that describes not provoking your children to anger, right? In fact, I think it's Ephesians 6 that uses the provoking to anger, and Colossians 3 that uses the exasperation terminology. Those are parallel ideas. Well, what's one way that we can clearly provoke our children to anger? Well, it's going to be by modeling it ourselves. What's that going to produce? Exasperation every time.
Right. Yeah.
And you think about Ephesians 4, 31 and 32, right?
Yep.
Kind to one another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another. What's it going to produce if I'm yielding to all that anger that in verse 31 it's telling me to die to? Well, I'm not going to have the fruit of verse 32, which is I'm not going to be a kind man. I'm going to be a harsh man. Yeah. It's going to stir up anger. Proverbs 15, right? I'm not going to be a forgiving man. I'm going to be an embittered man. Well, that's going to, Proverbs 18, hinder my relationship with the Lord and destroy my relationship with others. And as Matthew 18 would say. So consequences here are far reaching, and the biggest thing that we have to recognize in all of this is that God would be right to bring those consequences. If we really take it all back to, again, what in this sowing and reaping principle, we have to go back to this ultimately. a fear of God. I have to fear the Lord. Listen, in the Christian life, I know there's all kinds of discussion out there about perfect love casts out fear, and as if somehow fear just doesn't have that idea of actually being afraid. No, it does. You can't strip the word of what its essential meaning is. And clearly in Scripture, we are perfecting holiness in the fear of God. And the Scriptures constantly give us both encouragements as Christians and warnings. Warnings of chastening and warnings of consequences and warnings of what God would rightly bring in his love to us as believers, what he would rightly bring. And, Matthew 5 makes it clear that pursuit of anger is worthy of judgment, it says there. Now, that can be eternal judgment for those who are outside of Christ. For those who are within Christ, we recognize that we'd be worthy of the chastening and consequence that God would lovingly bring to our life. Why? Because he hates that sin. He knows how destructive it is, and he wants it out of our life, so he brings consequences so that we'll turn from it. So we have to take it back there ultimately to a fear of God and recognize that he would be right to bring them.
Yeah, really good. Well, this is sobering and encouraging. I want to be a man who fears the Lord, and I don't want to be a man who, to use your terminology, rots your family.
That's right.
So, okay, so what are some ways we can fight outbursts of anger? So this is the context. You're already angry. You're in that moment. Go. What do you do?
Yeah. Well, it's such a good question because that is the reality. We can talk about these big picture things and have to lay the groundwork of our understanding of what anger really is. But when the rubber really meets the road as to where we have to go with this is where we have to live, right? Okay, I'm tempted toward anger. And listen, the Bible makes it clear in our spiritual battle, we'll never be free from temptation. And nor should we expect to be free from temptation. The Bible makes it clear the Christian life is a battle from start to finish, from start line to finish line. You're in the trenches. You're in spiritual warfare. It's the norm of the Christian life. And, Ephesians 6 could not be more clear in regards to our need constantly to have the armor of God on. Why? It's fiery darts of the evil one. What are those? Those are temptations, right? Yeah. Those are temptations that are constantly flying our way. James 1 makes it clear our heart in its fallen condition, even though it's redeemed, we're still carrying around this old man. And so our heart is a constant factory of these lustful desires that are temptations, right? So we got the problem within, we got the problem without. Temptations are going to be flying our way. What needs to be the great encouragement to the Christian is that we have resources. Ephesians 1 tells us we have, the resurrection power of Christ coursing through our spiritual veins. What does his resurrection power represent? That's what Paul wanted the believers in Ephesus to comprehend there in Ephesians 1. It represents Christ's victory over sin, right? That he had victory over it. He abolished it, and not only on our behalf in the gospel, but in our ability in the Christian life to be able to put to death the deeds of the flesh. So we don't want to get discouraged by the battle, first and foremost. I mean, you could hear all of this and you could say, man, clearly I just have no faith and I don't fear God. And there's just, my life's just a train wreck. And here I am tempted again. And this is just another example of it. And we get discouraged. And then we start heading down a path of self-pity. And self-pity is never going to take us to a place where we actually battle. That's exactly where Satan wants us, is to self-pity, because then we're giving up. Yes. We're raising the white flag. We're yielding rather than battling. So we can't get discouraged by the battle. In fact, we should expect the battle. You should expect this every day, all day long, to be battling. Why? Because we live in a fallen world, and we know that life isn't going to go the way we expect it to go, or a way that's comfortable for us. In fact, Christ tells us this explicitly. John 16, in this world, you will have tribulation. You'll have trouble of all kinds. James 1, that we're to consider the multifaceted, highly varied types of trials that God brings into our life. We're to consider them joy in all their different shapes and sizes. And so again, just the example we go back to, the guy who cuts you off in the lane in front of you, right? The person who budges in the grocery line, or whatever it may be, these silly little things that we almost can feel like, man, Lord, I feel like I should be beyond this. Well, I've just got to recognize that's just pride, right? That I've just got to die to, or I shouldn't think that I'm beyond this. In fact, I should say, no, that's about right. It's about who I am. I am just that petty, but because of Christ, I now have the power to die to those things. So what do we have to do in that moment? Well, I think that's step one. So we need to not be surprised by the battle, and we need to not be taken off track by the fact that we're in the midst of a temptation. And then secondly, I would say we need to recognize what we're being tempted toward. We have to embrace the biblical definition. So we have to call our anger, and we have to stop calling it other things.
Hold on. I don't get angry, Brian. I get frustrated.
Frustrated. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I get frustrated. I get upset, right? I don't get angry. I get upset. It's not all these little subtle ways, or then we, and you can even hear it even sometimes when we're articulating it as anger, we almost talk ourselves right back out of it on the backside because we're like, wow, oh man, I got angry today at the kids, but man, you should have seen what they did. I mean, this kid did this. And by the way, the circumstances that were leading up to that, I mean, think about the work day that I had today and all the challenges. And then I walked through the door and my kid's doing that, and I told them not to, and they kept doing it. Well, these are all just justifications. We've got to stop that. We've got to identify it for what it is. And we've got to call our anger. That's what it is. It's anger. It's murderous thoughts. It's rebellion before God. It's unbelief in the heart. It's a lack of fearing God. And I've got to recognize that I'm being tempted toward all those things right now and nothing else. You start justifying it, you start excusing it, you start thinking about the circumstances or some perceived injustice or personal offense in it, and you're heading down the road of compromise every time. So I've got to call my anger what it is. I've got to call it anger. I've got to own the responsibility of it, kind of intrinsic in what we said. It's not outside of me, it's within me. And I've got to run to the resources that God supplies. So I've got to start immediately running to the scriptures and what the scriptures would call me to in those moments. And I think, just going back to James 1 for a moment, it describes there at the end, draw near to God and he will draw near to you, right? Here's the call. So he's just told us to resist the devil and he will flee from you. So what's resistance? Well, that's recognizing the sin for what it is. And that's choosing to not yield to the temptation. That's believing that I have the resources to overcome this. And then I need to draw near to God. I need to start to utilize those resources. And notice where he says this should go right away. See, draw near to God and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you double-minded. Be miserable, mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned into mourning and your joy into gloom. Humble yourself in the presence of the Lord. And he goes right to that issue of humility, right? We've got to humble ourselves. What does that mean? I've got to accept the circumstances that God has given as being from the hand of God. And I've got to choose to live by faith in the midst of them, that this is not a mistake, that this is ultimately good for me, even though in my plan, it's not good for my plan. It's not really about my plan. It's about God's plan, right? And James will even say later on, you who say today and tomorrow will go and do such and such a thing. He says, your life's a vapor. And shouldn't you rather say, if the Lord wills, right? So there's this submissive humility that we have to start to go to battle with right away. And what does that mean? That means we have to be running to the Lord. We have to humble ourselves before him in prayer. We have to admit what we're tempted toward. We have to admit that, Lord, I'm tempted to not trust you in this, and I've got to trust you. I've got to admit that, Lord, I'm tempted to justify this as something else, but I know it's anger, I know it's sin, and I've got to turn from that. Give me the strength in this moment. And Lord, I've got to run to your word. I've got to see it for what your word calls it. I've got to put off what you tell me to put off, and I've got to put on what you tell me to put on. And that takes us to some important texts in like Ephesians 4 again, 31 and 32. And I love what he describes there, in that he describes anger in all of its forms. It says in verse 31, let all, notice that word, all, bitterness and wrath, anger and clamor and slander be put away from you. And then he finishes the list along with all malice. So he encapsulates this thing twice and saying that word all. It's like bookends to make it clear. Hey, everything on this list, anything that would even sniff or smell of anything on this list, the distinction between these terms, you can come up with some distinctions, but essentially it's describing all the biblical terms for anger, right? Basically. So he's saying here, anger in all of its forms, any type of anger, any expression of anger, anything that would not pass the sniff test. It feels and sniffs and looks like anger. It says anything in that category, put it away from you. Recognize it to be what it is. Turn from it, right? And then he says proactively. Remember, all of this is in this whole context in Ephesians of, putting off the old man and putting on the new man, right? So that's what he's giving us practical applications of. So he says, now, what do I do instead? I be kind to one another. So what do I flood into my heart and my thinking in that moment? Okay, I'm tempted to get angry at this person and retaliate in some way. I need to put that off. That's what the Bible tells me is sin. What do I need to do instead? I need to think about how I can be kind toward this person. You know what that word actually means, kindness? It's an internal disposition of goodwill. Now that's hard work.
Yeah.
It's not even goodness. Like be good to them would be just do some external thing to serve them, right? Well, that'd be a lot easier. In fact, sometimes we'll do that in our anger. We'll be internally seething in bitterness, but we'll be externally in some self-righteous dynamic, actually doing what we ought to do externally. We'll serve them in some way, or won't say what we think we should say, or we'll go do what we're asked to do, or whatever it may be. But internally, we're angry. Well, he actually says, be kind. Internally, a disposition of goodwill toward that person, where you actually want what's best for them. Now that is hard work in the moment, right? Put that on. Be kind. And he says, tender-hearted. What is that? It's compassion. So again, remember, this is a perceived injustice, right? This is a perceived offense. You're looking at that person and you think they've done something they shouldn't have done. It's either a naive expression of it, which Christ even describes in Matthew 5 when he calls it you good for nothing, right? Raka, you good for nothing. The idea there is someone naive just did something stupid, right? Well, then the second description there in Matthew 5 is one that has more personal impunity. In other words, it's a known offense. They willingly and knowingly sinned against you. Well, in this case, this tenderheartedness is capturing this idea of a compassion towards this other person when they've done a wrong against you, right? Well, man, that takes a lot of work in the heart, right? And then he follows that up with this forgiveness, forgiving each other. So even if it's not just a perceived offense, right? But it's an actual offense, it's an actual sin, we're still commanded to forgive. And so I don't even have a right to act upon that. I'm not the judge and jury in this person's life. In fact, as a fellow sinner, I should be able to flood my life and my heart with compassion toward that other person, as God in Christ also has forgiven you. Right? I got to put myself in Matthew 18 immediately, where I'm like that unforgiving slave who's tempted to choke, tempted to choke my fellow slave. Right? I've been forgiven this great debt from the master, right? Yeah. Then I go and take that and choke out my fellow slave because he owes me a far lesser debt, far lesser. And I'm choking him out over that debt. But what am I not recognizing? I'm not forgiving as God in Christ also has forgiven you. I need to abandon those personal offenses. And I need to look on them with the compassion and love of Christ. And I need to proactively cultivate a heart of kindness, of goodwill toward them. And listen, that's going to be nothing short of war in your heart. That sounds really good. In our morning devotions, we read Ephesians 4, and it's like, oh yeah, just kind, tenderhearted, forgiving. That sounds great. But then we get into that moment and we just got to recognize that is going to be all out war, to battle, to just live by faith, because we won't see it in the moment. Say, no, this is justified. My anger's justified. There's been an offense here. They've wronged me. Justice needs to be done. We don't want to trust God with that. We got to bring about that justice ourselves. And we are just having to go to task with all those thoughts and put them all off so that we can cultivate goodwill, compassion, and forgiveness toward those who in our perception have wronged us.
Yeah.
And by the way, we need to talk about that perception issue a little bit, because just recognize that so much of the wrongs that we perceive in this area are not genuine sins against the other person.
Yeah.
1 Corinthians 13 and its expression of love talks about the fact that love believes all things.
Yeah.
And it talks in there also that we're not quick to take offense in regards to, the way others treat us. There is just a reality in our sin and in our fallen condition that we have a tendency to, in our self-righteousness, view offenses as from others as more culpable or greater than they are. Oftentimes, it's not a real sin against us. And there's not even any justice that needs to be done. It's just a circumstance that happened. And this other person is just the one that was a part of bringing it about. And our anger is over nothing other than God's providence in our life.
Yeah.
And so oftentimes those offenses that we see, those injustices that we see, they are just that. They're only perceived injustices and not true ones. And the ones that are true, we still have the obligation to forgive. But oftentimes we won't even know that in the moment, whether it's a real offense or a wrong one, because Matthew 7 just describes the log and the speck in the eye.
Yeah.
And it says, until you remove the log. So until you remove the log of anger, self-righteousness, pride, unbelief, all that stuff that gets in our heart, until you remove that, you won't have clarity, he says, to be able to help the other person with their speck. You don't even see it clearly. And you know what happens oftentimes? By the time you get that log out of your eye, you realize one of two things. Either whatever speck there is in that person's eye, it's so insignificant, it's not even worth dealing with.
Yeah.
Or there was no speck there to begin with.
Yeah.
And I'm just actually having to trust God with circumstances that I didn't like.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Yeah. Oftentimes, Brian, in those moments where, when it boils down, we're just so easily offended. We're just, and the culture doesn't help, right? Because you can be offended about anything now. So in those moments where I'm easily offended, I often pause and reflect back on how much I have been thinking of myself. Because it's hard to keep thinking about yourself if you're truly thinking about others and let's talk about prayer, praying for others, and your mind is just consumed with others. And might I even add scripture and things you've been meditating on? I find I'm less offended about, in my daily walk. I get less offended less often when my mind is consumed with others, outward, opposed to being inward. So yeah, this is helpful, really helpful stuff. So, okay. So we kind of talked about outbursts of anger and then you gave us some great encouragement and wisdom, really to kind of how to prepare yourself throughout the day. So, okay, let's talk real quick. Can we truly have righteous anger?
Yeah.
I think it's a question that that we've all thought of probably at times, and we probably have all thought that we've had righteous anger. So, anyways, speak on that.
Well, certainly righteous anger is something described in the scriptures. So even Ephesians 4, where we are here in a proactive call to believers, says, be angry and yet do not sin. Well, that would have to be by definition righteous anger. This is an anger that's not motivated by sinfulness. And that's why I said at the beginning, I think you have to have a definition that's broad enough to be able to encompass even righteous indignation. So it's desiring justice for a perceived injustice. So how do we equate that with righteous anger? Well, righteous anger would be this. It would be when that perceived injustice is an actual injustice. So let's put it this way. It's an actual sin against God, right? And then the means, and by the way, that terminology against God is important, because one of the things that we see always in regards to righteous indignation is that it has its grounding in how that sin affects God, not in how it affects us. right? When we're acting in some measure of righteous indignation, it's because God's honor, God's glory, God's reputation is on the line here, not our own, right? Or not some personal inconvenience or personal injustice. You consistently see, I mean, even Christ himself, 1 Peter 2, I mean, the greatest injustice in the history of the world is coming against him. And he didn't lash out in righteous indignation and anger in that moment to put Pilate where he belonged,
Right.
No, Christ was silent, it says in 1 Peter 2. Why? Because, well, two reasons. One, he knew the ultimate will of God in this was for him to go to this. So in that sense, his faith in God and in the providential plan of God was flooding into his thinking, so that when he looked at Pilate, it wasn't even a personal offense to him. It was like what Paul describes in the prison epistles when he describes himself as the prisoner, not of Rome, not of Nero, but the prisoner of whom? The Lord, right? Prisoner of the Lord. And so there's a recognition that God has brought these circumstances in my personal life that are bringing personal discomfort. It doesn't seem like righteous indignation in the Bible is ever related to personal offense or personal inconvenience in my life that someone else is bringing. It's always finding its grounding in God and his glory and his honor. So it's an actual sin, and it's an actual sin against God where God's honor is on display. And so then the expression of it, so the way that justice is pursued in that's important, because it's not for my own personal justice. It's not so that I can right some personal wrong in my life, right? My pursuit of justice in that is to justify God's reputation, right? To bring justice to God's reputation so that he's honored in the way he ought to be, so that that dishonor is not allowed to continue against him in some way without being checked. That's a righteous indignation, and it would always be accompanied by godly characteristics. So the expression of it would be godly, and everything that comes along with it would be right expressions of the fruit of the Spirit and godliness. What is that? Well, walk through the fruits of the Spirit. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. Right? Well, this does not have anything to do with our sinful expressions of anger. Our sinful expressions of anger are none of those things, right? Righteous indignation will always be all of those things. So this is why, like in John 2, when Christ is in the temple, right? And it's a pretty vivid scene there. I mean, he's whipping people, and he's turning over money tables and rebuking people harshly and severely for being turning his Father's house of worship into a den of robbers. Well, remember, driven by what? The honor of God. This is God's temple, and this is being desecrated by their actions. Remember, it's always accompanied by godliness, right? What did we see? Man, he sits down. It's just amazing to me. I mean, he sees all of that happening, and it says, zeal for your house will consume me in that very text, right? That's like the fulfillment of that Old Testament prophecy of Christ. Zeal for your house will consume me. So you think about that. He is filled with great zeal in righteous indignation toward everything that he sees. It's this great offense to him because of the way it's an offense to God. And yet, what does he do? He sits down and he calmly makes a whip to do what he's about to do. Perfect and total self-control. He's not out of control. He's not just responding and reacting. And in the midst of all of that, what is he doing? He's serving God and coming right out of that circumstance. What is he able to do? He's able to, with a clean conscience, minister to and serve and love and care for others and preach and teach about what God would have for them. There's no guilt on his conscience. There's no out of control. I've just got to cool down. I've got to go, find some space so that I can calm down here. There's no just reaction that's just knee jerk. There is a thoughtful, careful contemplation of how he needs to fight for the honor and glory of God in this. And it's completely controlled. And it's the perfect measure of zeal in its activity.
Yeah.
It's never going to be harsh in some sinful way, though it may be direct and it may be strong, right? And it certainly is there. And so, you see that. You see that in various places in the scriptures. I think of Moses destroying the 10 Commandments.
Yeah.
Right? He comes down in Exodus 32 and, there he is. And there's the people engaging in this horrific idol worship, and he's been up in the glory cloud for the entire month. I mean, talking about being consumed with the glory of God. And he comes down and in an act of righteous indignation that actually appeases the wrath of God there, right? He breaks the tablets of the 10 Commandments and then makes the people melt down the idol itself and drink it, not as a form of like vindictive hostility, but as a form of teaching and instruction and hatred for what that sin is and a desire to completely destroy it and force them to own the responsibility for what they did in regards to their sin against God. Then he goes back up to the mountain, right?
Yep.
And you don't find Moses going back up to the mountain in some massive like confession booth, where he's just getting on his knees in dust and ashes as if he's just sinned greatly against God. No, in fact, everything in that would tell you, in that section would tell you that was a right expression of defense of the glory of God against great sin for a man who had authority as the leader of those people. But here's what we have to recognize in our life. I mean, if we really look at that, and there's multiple examples you could go to, but if you really look at that and you start thinking about the times you're angry,
right.
I mean, how often has that happened in your life?
I don't think that's ever happened in my life.
Yeah, exactly. And, biblically, that would hold true also. Righteous indignation, by far and away, anger, when it's talked about biblically, is consistently talked about as sinful. A vast majority of the anger that we have is sinful. And it's based upon our own desires for our own life, our own personal comforts. We're fighting for our own personal justice, and we're not willing to trust God with the circumstances he's brought. And so we try to manipulate and try to lash out at other people in order to get the circumstances we want, or punish people or circumstances that didn't give us those things. Yeah. So that's where we primarily live, So what might be some of those expressions? I don't know. You'd have to think about that in your own life. I think some of the things going on in our country can produce some righteous indignation for a man to speak out. Now, it's not going to be the vehement, rebellious, let's storm the White House type. That should have no place in a Christian's life. That's not righteous indignation. But it's certainly going to be speaking out against the atrocities of, our definition of marriage that's eroding and our embracing of things that God hates, and, murderous realities in our culture of abortion and now euthanasia in Canada, just north of us. And even in our country, it's trending that direction. And, these things that are just an offense to a holy God. For us to hate those things is right and good, but we have to be careful of the expression of it. And we have to be careful because those things also are tied up in our comfort, right?
Right.
So as a culture, we want the things that make us comfortable. And so it's convenient for us to call something righteous indignation, when in reality, we haven't checked our heart to recognize, no, I just don't like living in a culture where I don't have a comfortable, secure future as a Christian. I don't like the thoughts of persecution. I don't like the thoughts of all these uncomfortable things that I'm seeing raise up in my culture and my kids who have to, be around all of that stuff. That's not comfortable for me. Well, we've got to die to those things because those are personal things. And we got to fuel hatred for those things because of the way they offend God. And we've got to trust God with all of his providence in our life for how they may infringe upon our comforts, and just rest that those things are in the hand of God, not ours.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, I just, as you were talking, thinking of David when he says, against you and you alone have I sinned, so in a world that's totally gone crazy and chaotic, like it's any of these unrighteous deeds are against God.
Absolutely.
And so that's where our mind needs to be. But you're right, we loop ourselves in there.
Well, and again, what you reap what you sow.
Yeah.
And so we could find ourselves as Christians in this culture, claiming something as righteous indignation that in all actuality is just an expression of personal sinful anger.
Yeah.
And what's it going to do? It's going to destroy our testimony for the gospel and for Christ. It's going to hinder those things and harm them. And, so we've got to be careful with that. And I would say be slow to come to the conclusion that something's righteous indignation and be thoughtful about examining your heart. And if it's truly righteous indignation, then you're going to have self-control.
Yeah.
And you're going to be able to sit and examine, and you're not going to have this massive urgency to act right now. Anytime you're feeling some of that, that you can't even stop and think and assess what's going on in your heart, but you just feel this massive, overwhelming burden to have to say what you want to say right now, that might be an indication that what I'm in might not be righteous indignation, but might actually be sinful anger.
Yeah.
So,
good stuff. Yeah. Okay, so as we close here, talk to us about the importance of repenting of your own anger so that you can shepherd your wives and children in dealing with their anger. You mentioned it earlier, just leading in this area. So give us some encouragement as we try to be strong, courageous men.
Totally. Well, spiritual leadership is everything in the home. You set the tone for home life in a very real sense. And God's given that role to you as a leader. And so as a man, again, if we think about the sowing and reaping principle, I recognize that in my leadership, I am going to reap what I sow in that area. And so that should promote a fear of God. And, I think about what Paul says to Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 4, this great section on spiritual leadership at the church level, but certainly the principles here would apply to spiritual leadership at any level. He says in verse 16, pay close attention to yourself and to your teaching. Notice what he says there, yourself first, your own personal character. Pay close attention to yourself and to your teaching. Persevere in these things, for as you do this, you will ensure salvation both for yourself and for those who hear you. God will use your influence in great ways for gospel impact. You'll have security and assurance. It's the means that God will use as you strive in humility and in zeal and in a fear of God to turn from the sin that would otherwise consume you. You'll ensure your own salvation in that sense, in, again, a security and an assurance sense. And you'll ensure the salvation for those who hear you, for your own children, your own wife, those who you're going to have the greatest spiritual impact on, and the relationships of whom hit the closest to home, right? I mean, in both a literal sense, but in a figurative sense as well, right at the center of our heart. There's no greater heartache than as a man having to walk through seasons of family life where I look at what's been produced in my family and I recognize that I have to own culpability in that because I wasn't willing to battle some of these things that I should have battled. I was an angry man while my kids were growing up, and now they're exasperated teenagers. Well, in order to deal with that, I'm going to have to own a great amount of culpability before the Lord, and I'm probably going to have to accept some consequences for at least a season. The Lord may use my humility as I repent of that to be a testimony to my kids' life, but it would only be in spite of all those years, of anger and it was unrestrained. In regards to a wife who, I'm going to be promoting within her a fear rather than fueling faith in God and demonstrating for her what that looks like. I'm demonstrating for her a lack of faith in God as I'm yielding to anger. I'm demonstrating for her a desire to manipulate outside of the scriptures through my anger. And so what's she going to do? She's going to follow my leadership, or at least have a temptation to follow my leadership. And I'm going to be a stumbling block, right? Well, greater to be thrown into the depths of the sea with a millstone tied around your neck than to cause one of these little ones to stumble. So as a husband, and a father, man, we have an immense responsibility in this. And along with that, we have a great opportunity. Man, the ways that God can use us. Just think about Paul's relationship to Timothy. Follow me as I follow after Christ. Think about that. Paul's exhortation to the church in Ephesus in Ephesians 20. I'm free from the blood of all men. What's he saying there? He's not washing his hands of any care for the Ephesian church. What he's saying there is, I have a clean conscience. I've ministered house to house. I've cared for you. I've loved you. I've preached the gospel to you. I've shepherded you. poured myself out. I've been a godly example to you, and I'm free from the blood of all men. I have a clean conscience. And that was even in the face of him knowing that savage wolves were going to come in, right? And we're going to seek to tear the flock to pieces, as it says there in Ephesians 20. Acts 20. But yet Paul could have a clean conscience, and he could rest, and he could entrust them, he says, to God and the word of his grace. Why? Because Paul had been the instrument that God would call him to be. He no doubt hadn't been a perfect man, but he had been a faithful man. And man, that's what we're after. As men, we won't be perfect. And listen, you're going to have to be one who goes back and seeks forgiveness frequently and regularly. And that's not a bad example as a dad, right? I want my kids to be able to see the power of the gospel. I don't want to just be living in defeat and having to go seek forgiveness for years and years and decades of their life and them see no growth in areas of consistent sin in my life. But I do want them to see as a pattern me as a man who is going to own the areas where I've sinned and where I have weakness and where those weaknesses are ongoing. And so we're going to have to seek forgiveness often in this area. And we're going to have to go back and own areas of sin. And as we seek forgiveness, seek it fully, for the sin that we've actually committed, and not justify it, not excuse it, try to minimize it in some way. Just go to him, say, I was angry and I was motivated by this ruling desire, that was selfish and earthly minded. And I wasn't trusting God in these ways. Will you forgive me for that? You have to pick your kids up off the floor sometimes if that's not your pattern, if you were to say something like that. But what a great example that can be for them. And so, as dads, as husbands, we have to feel the weight of spiritual leadership that God lays upon us. We have to recognize the great responsibility that is and the great opportunity that is. And we have to recognize that we're going to have to live an authentic Christian life before them, which includes our sin, but we're going to have to deal with it in a biblical, godly way consistently. And then you'll be free from the blood of all men. You'll have been faithful to the Lord, and you'll be an instrument in God's hands that he can use for salvation and sanctification of those under your leadership as a man, as well as your own life. So that's really the aim. Yeah.
Well, Brian, this has been super encouraging. As a friend of mine would say, this has been heart surgery. It's been, sobering, yet super encouraging. So thank you for your time. And my wife and I thank you for your pastoral leadership with us in Grace Life. So,
Privilege, Caleb. Thanks for having me, brother.